And we're back. You're listening to the Talkin' Boxing with Billy C. show. Glad you guys could join us. I want to give a special shout out for ESPN New Hampshire. Glad to be part of your programming today. And we hope that we're part of it for a long time. Don't forget to buy a copy of my book. It's out there right now. Tom Molyneux, From Bondage to Baddest Man on the Planet. You can pick it up right now. I mean, you can pause this show and go buy it right now on Amazon.com or BarnesandNoble.com, or hop in the car and go to where all good books are sold and pick up a copy today. Trust me, you won't regret it. Now, if you're looking to get a signed copy, visit our website, www.billycboxing.com, and click on the book club section and click the proper option. There's two options there. And the guy who wrote the foreword in this book is going to be joining us here in a second, because it's time for
Blast from the Past.
We shine the spotlight again on fighters from years past.
Top-ranking Joe Louis is the leading contender.
Joe Frazier with a left hook. Good right hand thrown by Foreman that time. Look at that left hook.
Belt that goes to Ray Mancini.
It's Blast from the Past on Talkin' Boxing.
this week's Blast from the Past, which is being sponsored by KOFantasyBoxing.com. Check it out, KOFantasyBoxing.com. Features a fighter that it just sticks in my mind about this guy. I remember watching him and just getting chills watching this guy fight. He was on TV quite a bit. He was a former light heavyweight contender and really made his fame behind bars. We used to watch these fights from the Rawway prison in New Jersey. And this week's Blast from the Past is on James Scott. And joining me right now to tell us all about James Scott and the guy who wrote the foreword in the great book on Tom Molyneux, From Bondage to Baddest Man on the Planet, Alex Propali. What's up, brother?
Good evening, Billy C. How are you?
Not too bad, not too bad. Still reeling with the rankings and the weight divisions. I don't know what I should think, but
well, I tell you something. I'm very glad. I'm not. If you want to have a conference call about all-time heavyweight rankings, I am not up for that. No way.
You don't like my choices, huh? The thing is that, those types of rankings are so subjective. There is no right or wrong. What we're trying to do with our normal rankings is make it not subjective. Make it, hey, listen, it is what it is. This guy beat that guy. He moves in the spot. But once you get to all-time, even pound for pound, there is no right or wrong answer. You could feel strongly about whatever. Floyd Mayweather is number one, and somebody else might think, somebody else should be number one. And nobody's right or wrong. It's opinion. It's a fantasy, ranking. So don't beat yourself up too bad, Alex. Hopefully you'll get plenty of sleep tonight. But
all right, I'll try not to hate on your rankings.
Right. I can't believe. Lennox Lewis. I just was so. I just wasn't a big fan of his at the time, and now.
Where was Ali again on the list? Was he at number 5?
Yeah, he was down. These were my personal favorites. Doesn't necessarily, Ali was, you can say he's number one. Jack Johnson, to me, is number one. I don't know. Jack Johnson, was a guy that just, and during a time when the heavyweight division was considered the best ever, and the only era that people even compare that one to is Ali's era, So, anyway, that's for another show. James Scott. True. A guy that I don't know if you remember seeing him behind bars fighting, but man, it always added a dimension to it. Tell us about James Scott.
James Scott is a light heavyweight, and this, speaking of a great era, he was an active light heavyweight in a great era. James Scott, born October 17th, 1947. And like you said, he grew up in Newark, New Jersey, but around 13 he got into trouble and he ended up in a reform school. And was spent most of his life in institutions. That's where it started. It took about 8 years, I guess, that he was in there. He went in there in 1960, it looks like, and then he started boxing. The Galway State Prison he ended up in, I guess, as transferred as he got old enough, or there was another crime that he committed. There was an armed robbery that he committed, and looks like there was a murder associated with it.
Right.
That ends up coming up later in his life. That sort of comes back to haunt him.
Well, what happened? What happened was he was in and out of jail, like you said, as a youth, right? And then when he was an adult, he ended up getting busted for other crimes. That robbery, which resulted in a death, it's kind of strange. What happened was he was tried for the robbery first, and then found guilty and was put behind bars. Then, I guess, for the way they presented it, the prosecution, then he went on trial for the murder of the person that was robbed and was convicted of that and was ultimately sentenced to a life sentence, which we'll get to later. But an interesting thing I just want to point out was that he claims there's some discrepancies about when he actually started. These guys, we always hear about the older fighters, from really far away eras, not knowing when they really started, or them fighting under different names, and all of that stuff that took place. But something similar with James Scott. There is some discrepancies of when his career actually started. Some people believe that it started in the 60s versus his first fight on record being 1974, where he claims, when he saw Reuben Carter fight, well, ironically enough, a guy from the same area as him with a similar story as him, and became interested in boxing.
Yeah, that's what sort of is kind of. I guess it's not too surprising in a way, because the fact that he had spent so much time in an institution, probably have a lot to do other than do push-ups and watch TV, and that's what he ended up seeing and gravitating towards. That's the story of the prison boxer, Reuben Hurricane Carter. And you're right. Once he was released after some of those youth offenses, he ended up relocating to Miami Beach, and that's where he started fighting. And then once he got sentenced to the armed robbery, he ended up in Galway. And Galway State Prison in New Jersey had I guess the crime was actually in New Jersey as well. But the Galway had a program that you worked, and there were different kinds. The inmates worked, and there was different kinds of labor in there. And one of them was fighting, was boxing. They trained people to be trainers, cut men as well as prize fighters. So you earned a little bit of a payment, as well as you can get points, towards your sentence.
When he got out the first time out of prison, not reform school, and he ultimately turned pro and was living down in Florida. When you look at his record, so assuming that we're going to follow his pro career starting in 1974 against John L. Johnson, check out the fights that they threw him in. I mean, nobody was looking out for him, it seems, in his first bunch of fights. I mean, John L. Johnson was a big up-and-comer. They were actually they thought they were feeding James Scott to John L. Johnson, and it was I believe a scheduled 6 or 8 round fight, and he knocks this guy out. And a couple of fights later, he's in with a grizzled veteran, again, looking to get his own career back on track against Baby Boy Raleigh, and beats him. And then Ray Anderson is another experienced fighter. This is all within a couple of months, all the same year. And ultimately, in 1975, Jesse Burnett, the last fighter he fought in Florida. I mean, out of those fights that he fought in Florida, he wasn't exactly getting coddled. Yeah,
I mean, some of those guys, their records are not the greatest, but They definitely are some veterans, and I'm not sure how much of an amateur background he had. He definitely was a big, strong guy, intimidating. He liked to use it and try to intimidate his opponents. He was 6'1" tall, and boxing at light heavyweight, 175 pounds. I like the name Hydra Lacey in his second fight. That's a great fighter name. Once some of those Rahway State prisons, several of them were on regular TV. One of them was actually on HBO, the Eddie Mustafa Muhammad fight. Who his name used to be Eddie Gregory rather, and he that fight is on HBO. It's on YouTube. John Dunphy, Sugar Ray Leonard, and Larry Merchant do the commentary, which is kind of cool.
It was a great fight. It was a great fight against Eddie Mustafa Muhammad in that one. And you're right, Harold Letterman is the judge for that one, and he does go on a stretch with Letterman and Larry Hazard as ref in quite a few of those. Exactly. That's right. You just took the words. You took the words right out of my mouth. In the prison fights, when he fought, basically the rest of his career from the prison system. Larry Hazard was a staple as a referee, and Harold Letterman as a judge. And those fights, I don't know if you remember them, but I remember watching those fights and just saying, man, it gave you chills because the prisoners were behind. You could see that they were separate. And I think we even talked to Larry once about him, a while ago. And he said, very small audience because they weren't allowed to bring people in. And the TV crews, he said it was very, very strange feeling. You got and ultimately his last fight. They let him keep fighting until he lost. He did have that loss against Jerry Martin prior to his last fight against Dwight Muhammad Qa'i, but it seemed like that was the end of that they weren't going to do those fights anymore. I didn't know if there was a reason for that or not. Why he didn't continue his career? Did you come up with anything on that?
I didn't see why he retired from boxing, but yeah, that was a pretty soul-crushing loss. There was an aspect of inmate street cred or prison cred in that bout because, of course, Dwight Muhammad Qa'i. And again, let's keep in mind, these are a bunch of brutes. This is the 175-pound division you dream about. These guys are badasses. You got Eddie Mustafa Muhammad, Jerry Martin, Dwight Muhammad Qa'i, Yaqui Lopez. The scene also included, of course, Matthew Saad Muhammad, and Michael Spinks was coming up right at this time. So there was a lot of dangerous light heavyweights. And it, like you said, it probably was not the easiest thing to put those fights together, but I think we lived in a different time. Nowadays, there's so many. We've had the whole, that idea of being real tough on crime and real tough on inmates. I don't think we've tried to outlaw weightlifting programs for inmates. The idea that there would be a program that would teach boxing to inmates and then try to help them get jobs in boxing, that just is not something that would happen in this day and age of America. That's very in the 70s. So I would have to think that that was one of the reasons why, it kind of faded away. It was 1981 was that last bout.
Well,
the whole tough on crime, just say no, all that that era was beginning. So it could be that just the powers that run boxing, which has a large degree to do with the who's going to broadcast it. Maybe they weren't interested in doing those kind of fights anymore.
I think logistically from the prisons, it made more modern broadcasts a little more difficult. But just to comment on your comment about the program, to me, having boxing type programs in a controlled atmosphere in a prison, seems to be more economically suiting for the taxpayers. It's not as expensive versus, letting prisoners become attorneys and accountants and getting their college degrees and having, cable television and internet and cell phones. And, we're talking about, we don't want them to, learn how to fight, but instead let's give them their law degree, so I don't know, I don't know if it just became logistics or not. I do know one of my fighters happens to be incarcerated, and he told me that they do not let pros fight. He's in the Louisiana system, and he says that they let, and he was a pro, so he's allowed to teach other inmates how to fight. They do have boxing programs, but only on an amateur level. And I wonder if the James Scott life and what he did as a pro from prison. I wonder if that was a reason that they decided that they were not going to let professionals fight behind bars. And one other thing, getting back to the opponents you mentioned, you rattled off a couple of major names in the sport of boxing to this day, like Yaki Lopez, Dwight Muhammad Qawi, and of course Eddie Mustafa Muhammad, all fighters that James Scott fought.
Right, yeah, and Qawi, of course, was formerly Dwight Braxton. He had been incarcerated in Rahway as well, and he was a guy who had gotten out of jail and become a successful world champion, and then was coming back into Rahway and defeats James Scott, the toughest guy in Rahway, inmate number 57735, as he was known there. But you're right, he was earning money during these were prize fights. When he knocked out Richie Cates, he earned $8,000. One thing that was interesting is that 10% was going to be donated to a fund for victims of violent crimes. So I'm not sure if that's something that he did, or if they his management said, "Hey, how about if you do something like this?" And then he has other funds. I guess he was working the job that he was doing in there. Or no, Kate's made $15,000 in that same loss. So it does show you that his purse was smaller, but Kate's was the guy who had been at that time. He had been through 30 rounds with Victor Galendez, which was another tough guy in the light heavyweight division. But the thing that he definitely tried to intimidate guys, and that was one of the things that was interesting about Dwight Muhammad Qawi, because it didn't work on him in the least. And he felt that he said about him, he's slow as molasses, as Qawi saying about Scott. He's slow as molasses, it's just that he's tough. But supposedly in that fight, even though it was largely one-sided, and Scott was never hurt, but he fought too defensive. And, Braxton won a unanimous decision, or rather, Qawi won a unanimous decision.
That fight was if you watch any of the other James Scott's fights, the Dwight Muhammad Qawi fight, which was ultimately his last pro fight, was unlike any other fight that he fought that you can see. He was always an aggressive, kill or be killed type of a fighter, and not that fight. He was fighting cautious. I think he was very respectful. I think, he was nervous. Remember, Qawi was at the top of rising at the top of his game as well at that time. And that whole run of opponents that he fought while he was in prison, I think were all pretty good, with the exception of the first one against Dago Robertson. The rest of them are all pretty good. He did get that David Lee Royster fight that was kind of, to help set up the Dwight Muhammad Qawi fight after his loss against Jerry Martin. But, when you look at James Scott's career, really from the beginning against John L. Johnson all the way to his final fight in 1981, the majority of those fights were against a better than average opposition. Those fights early in his career, those guys may not look like they were good, like the Ray Andersons with 35-11, but these, like you said earlier, Alex, this is an era. This is 1974. This is an era where there was some talented fighters out there, and a lot of them. So to have 6, 8, 10 losses didn't mean you were a garbage fighter by any stretch.
No, definitely. And you're right. I mean, it's sort of interesting because I did not watch that whole Kawi fight, but I think it is on. I think it is on YouTube. But I wonder, he must have chose to fight a little more defensively, try to box Kawi, and that's always interesting when a guy who's more slugger tries to do that.
Well,
in this article, I have a post-fight article. He said, "I fought a smart fight. Everybody's used to me going forward." And then Kawi said about him, Scott works on fear, but I was not afraid. I went to South Africa where they got tanks and guns, and if you think I'm scared coming here with all the protection I've got, you've got to be kidding.
And Kwai was a guy that was a power puncher too, So I think James Scott just got out of his comfort zone. And one other thing, I keep bringing up that John L. Johnson fight because even though he was 8-0, this is a guy's pro debut. James Scott, pro debut, 8-0 against John L. Johnson. The facts on that fight was that Scott weighed, technically, if the cruiserweights were around, he was a cruiserweight. He weighed 178. But the remarkable thing was Johnson weighed 217. That was technically a heavyweight fight. Oh
my God! Look at John L. Johnson's record. That loss might have. It looks like it ruined him.
That loss did ruin him. He was an up and coming 8-0 fighter with 8 knockouts. He was being hand fed James Scott. They were giving James Scott to John L. Johnson because he looked good. He was a chiseled guy. He looked good. He was a mean looking guy, and they figured that this was going to be it for James Scott. One and done. Out of jail. They were trying to sell it like that. They did not put James Scott in that fight with John L. Johnson with any thought other than John L. Johnson coming out of there with the W.
Wow. Yeah, and he ends up upsetting him, knocking that guy out. And then, if you look, he only won 4 more fights in his entire career, and he was knocked out by Jose Nino Revolta, knocked out in one by Tony Tubbs, knocked out by Scott Ledoux in 5. Wow, it looks like that fight was a major turning point in his life, and not for the better.
And the thing is that also goes and reiterates what I'm saying. John L. Johnson was a legitimate heavyweight. All the names you mentioned are all heavyweights.
They are, yeah, every single one of them. Yeah.
And James Scott was a light heavyweight.
Yeah, so he had a big punch.
James Scott, for people that, aside from what we're talking about, his style of fighting was a kill or be killed. He was very aggressive with the exception of his last fight, like Alex mentioned. But of his life as a young man, he spent 36 years behind bars. And actually, he was sentenced, the murder that he got charged with, Everett Russ was a drug dealer, and he got basically he was already sentenced to the robbery portion between 30 and 40 years, and then in 1981, just prior to the Kwai fight, he was convicted and received a life sentence for the murder. Which he was supposed to serve concurrently, the 30 to 40, then the life sentence. So you would have thought that he was never going to get out of jail. Nay, he was released from prison in 2005 after serving his time. Now, I actually had reached out to James Scott a couple of years ago and was not able to talk to him. I wanted to have him come on this show. I talked to his brother, and one of the reasons they did indeed let him out of the slammer was his failing health. He started developing Alzheimer's, and he just he wasn't able to conduct an interview. His brother offered to come on and do the interview for him, and I just didn't think it would have the same impact. So that was the latest I heard on James Scott, that he's living in New Jersey. He is happy. He's out of jail, and he's not in the best of condition right now.
Well, yeah, that's too bad. Not too different a story than we hear a lot of times.
Over and over and over, right?
Yeah.
The only thing that he adds to the mix a little bit was the jail. Was the jail. Now there is a book that was either being written or is written about him. I don't have the details. It was one of the things I was talking to his brother about. The possibility of a book on him, but I think one is in the works, or he's approved one, or maybe they're writing one. I don't know what the deal is, but it is one of those stories, like you said in the beginning, Alex, where for some reason we're kind of drawn to this kind of. I mean, here this guy is a convicted life criminal, really, and we're drawn to him, and especially with the boxing from the prison, right on TV, right on network television, and even HBO.
Yeah, I think we always, everybody likes the bad guys. They're a little more interesting, and I think, America has the sort of that love affair with the Billy the Kids of the world, and I think we also want to believe that, and especially this is what is not true. I think that spirit is dying. That spirit that we used to have of, like, wanting to see people rehabilitate themselves, and that's why I think that it would be, pretty unlikely. Although I do remember seeing a documentary about a basketball program in a prison, but those kind of things, you don't see that all too much nowadays. We have politicians push the idea of hard time, so they slash the hell out of programs like that. But you're right. I mean, one of the things that was interesting about that Richie Cates fight, I mean, I'm not sure all of this kind of stuff is always positive, but the Richie Cates fight was interesting because one of the things that I was reading was Richie Cates was a prison official. So it was, and this is a little bit of a bad side of it, but you had an inmate putting his hands all over a prison official in that fight, and he ends up stopping him.
You know what? That fight, I think, was one of the network television ones, and that was one of the fights that almost prevented other fights from coming back, because the other prisoners were almost in a frenzy watching.
They must have loved it.
Yeah, watching the prison guard get beat up. Hey, listen, I got to take a break, Alex. Hold that thought, and we'll come back and finish our blast on James Scott, and I'll get your thoughts on some other stuff in about 2 minutes. So we'll be back in 2.
Talking Boxing with Billy C. Every week, 2 hours of the best boxing talk on the radio.
I have a bunch of questions, Donnell, right? If you feel like you want to, you can answer for JD first. Why will you win? JD Chapman, why will you win?
Baby Holmes will get sick and get hit by a train that day on the way to the fight, or he might have diarrhea, he might have the flu, he might throw up. One of his eyeballs might fall out that day, and I might get lucky.
Talking Boxing
with Billy C. If you want your voice heard on Talkin' Boxing with Billy C., then call our hotline at 845-228-8710. Leave a voicemail, or you could just tell Billy C. that you like his mustache.
Should I ask you your opinion about this idea?
I'm just trying to give you the encouragement.
Listen, all I need from you is to make sure you don't hang up on people.
And if we like your call, we'll play it back on the air.
You have the knowledge and wisdom of boxing because of what you do and how well you do it.
Leave your name, hometown, and what you think of the show. 845-228-8710. We want to hear you.
Hey, fight fans, check out KOFantasyBoxing.com. KO Fantasy Boxing is boxing's only trademarked fantasy game. Check it out, www.KOFantasyBoxing.com. Select your own gym, your own fighters, track them through a season that can last from 3 months to a year, depending upon which league you join. You got to check this out, man. www.KOFantasyBoxing.com. Join it today. Again, www.KOFantasyBoxing.com. And tell them Billy C sent ya.
Broadcasting in all corners of the globe, on the web and radio.
He would scoff at a stretcher, that man, I would think.
Palla tagliata, messa fuori, c'è
You're listening to Talkin' Boxing with Billy C. From upstate New York and the good old US of A.
Boxing is here to stay because we are here to stay.
The best 2 hours of boxing talk on the airwaves.
And we're back. You're listening to the Talkin' Boxing with Billy C show. We're right in the middle of our blast from the past this week. And this week, Alex Perpali and I are talking about light heavyweight contender James Scott. And just before we went to break, Alex, you mentioned about James' fight against Richie Cates. And that was a prison guard. And the electricity that must have been flowing then was pretty crazy during that fight. I remember watching that one. I'm pretty sure it was that one on network television.
Yeah, I looked and I didn't see that it was on YouTube, unfortunately. But the articles I was reading, they were describing it as being on network TV. So yeah. That must have been quite something. I can imagine the energy was pretty electric watching a guard get roughed up.
Yeah, I could see why they changed that. And one thing I just want to comment on prison life from them versus now. Now it's almost like some of these, which is totally ridiculous. I'm sure they realize they make a mistake, but there's some of these younger gang members that purposely get arrested so that they can be part of a community in jail, which makes no sense to me. I mean, years gone by, people get popped and they do their time and want to get the hell out. Now it just seems there are some people that think that they want to go. So I can't figure it out. But it's not a good thing, no matter what, whether it's hard time or easy. Then you just read the other day that a guy was serving a life sentence for marijuana, and they finally let him out after 20 years, and 20 years of his life sentence, for pot, and you got people that are, murdering others, and, a technicality gets them out, and you got a guy who I think he had 6 pounds of pot in the state of Missouri, was serving a life sentence with no parole, and they just reversed it. I mean, come on, man, who the hell made those rules, right?
Wow, yeah. That's crazy.
Anyway, James Scott.
I did put him into the title bout championship boxing game, and because he is from a great light heavyweight era, and I think it's kind of cool. We have two, I'm going to use the word great, but I think the two real big punchers and big dangerous guys in Adonis Stevenson and Sergey Kovalev. So I was curious, how would they match up? So I put in against Adonis Stevenson first, and James Scott beat him. Stopped him in the 6th round by technical knockout. Stevenson dropped Scott in the 5th, but then Scott got up and put Stevenson out in the next round. When they fought 100 times, James Scott does dominate him. Well, not dominate. Yeah, dominate. 62 wins out of 100 fights. 62 wins, 33 defeats, 5 draws. Scott stopped him 48 times, and of Adonis Stevenson's 33 wins, 16 were by knockout. And of course, the two of them would have matched up nice if you were to promote that fight, because you have. If it was in prison, that would be great. You have it in the prison against a guy who, has that pimp past and violent past in Adonis Stevenson. So,
yeah, and just before you go on to the next one, I buy that. Not the jail pimp thing. I buy the results of the title bout championship computer game, the simulation game. I'm glad that it came out like that, because I believe that. Listen, don't get me wrong, everyone. I'm not saying James Scott is an all-time great fighter or anything like that. He's clearly a blast from the past type of fighter that if you don't know anything about, you should look up these videos that Alex is pointing you to. But this guy was no joke of a fighter. And Adonis Stevenson, who at least Adonis thinks he's the best light heavyweight out there today, James Scott, and true to the title bout championship computer game, beat his ass. And I think he would have in a real fight too, Alex.
Yeah, I could see it happening. I definitely think. I thought that was one of those results that, broke the way I would have thought. This next one, I'm not sure it does. Sergey Kovalev versus James Scott. I had them fight the first time. Kovalev trounced him, stopped him in 2 rounds. No knockdowns. He was pummeling him in a corner. When they fight 100 times, James Scott gets the better of Kovalev. And he actually did better against Kovalev than he did against Stevenson, which I would disagree with. He goes 69 wins, 29 defeats, 2 draws. He stops Kovalev 46 times. Of Kovalev's 29 wins, he scored 13 knockouts.
Wow. Kovalev is so much bigger than him, though. I mean, how tall is Kovalev? James Scott was 6'1" in his prime. Kovalev's got to be over 6'1", isn't he?
Sergey Kovalev is no, he's only 6 feet tall.
Yeah. Okay. Well, you know what? James Scott was a big boy, I guess.
He was big, but I think Kovalev fights longer, fights taller. I don't know. That'd be a good matchup. Yeah.
Well, it just goes to show you, ladies and gentlemen, that James Scott is a worthy blast from the past, no doubt. And interesting outcome with the title bout championship computer game for both. I mean, I'm not surprised with Adonis Stevenson, but I am surprised with Kovalev, like you. But
and I think the thing about him too that we should point out is that even though he doesn't have a lot of fights, I mean, he's only got 22 fights in his whole career. A lot of substance in some of those victories, and even the losses. That goes a long way. So in terms of who you fight, a lot better than just as long as you keep fighting.
Exactly. And like I said, there's more than 3/4 of his fights collectively of his whole body of work were against very good opposition, So great job as usual. James Scott, his career record, 19 wins, 11 by knockout. He had the 2 losses, but he was never stopped. He had a granite chin. He had 1 draw. He fought 173 rounds for those 22 fights with a 50% knockout ratio. James Scott, he's still with us, living in New Jersey, but he's not behind.
And I would suggest to you, Billy C., is get Larry Hazard's take on this guy at some point, because I bet Larry would have some cool recollections of that. What I notice here in his record, the 1 draw that he had against David Lee Royster, that is in his second to last fight. That's he avenged that draw and knocks out Royster. So, and Larry was the ref. So I wonder if I wouldn't be surprised if Larry had some good James Scott stories.
No, actually, his draw was way early in his career. It was when out of Miami Beach. That David Lee Royster fight, he won by a 7th round knockout. I'm showing.
Right, but David Lee Royster was the guy who drew with him in Miami Beach.
Oh, right. It was a rematch of that fight. Yeah.
So he avenged it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I will talk to Larry about that when he comes on. But great job as usual with the blast, Alex. You always do a fantabulous job. And now I get to ask you